Up doing something like this. Very simple. You load some students. You can click on a student. Oh, that's kind of weird with the box, huh? I'm gonna get rid of that box. This is basically the kind of stuff you need to know for the code challenge. And if we have time, we can also cover doing like a form or something like that. So Jane, I'm gonna put a fake age. I don't want people to know how old I am. Let's see, what kind of image should I get? Cat pictures. I like this one. So something like that. No, I exist on the DOM. Something like that. So small basic app, but we're gonna start completely from scratch. I'm gonna get rid of all this stuff. I'm gonna get rid of this DB.json. We'll get into DB.json, but we're not gonna start with that. I'm gonna get rid of this index.html. We're gonna do all this from scratch. I'm going to get rid of everything in this index.js. And we don't even have to build this app. We can build something totally different if you guys are interested.
Wait, so why? I mean, the index.html is like...
We need an index.html.
So we're just gonna make one up?
So who knows the shortcut for making an index.html file? HTML tab. So now we have stuff. What does the title tags do for you?
Like something on the tab.
Exactly. So what should we call it?
Big review.
Big review. Cool. Do we want to put anything in the body? Let's put H1. Roadmap review. So this gives us a basic HTML, right? Everyone knows how to do this, right? Now we can open. And we have our basic HTML. How do I link a JavaScript file to it?
Script tag?
Yes, where?
I found it mostly works when it's at the bottom there, right before the end of the body.
Yeah, there's a few different places to put it. You can put it there.
Another question.
Mm-hmm.
So Graham said something about putting inside the head.
You can put it inside the head as well.
What was the issue? Was there an issue with that? I can't remember.
There's an issue with putting it inside the head because if your JavaScript runs right away, like this file is read top down. So if you have your script tag here and there's some JavaScript in there that relies on DOM elements, for instance, this H1, and the JavaScript file runs first, and this isn't loaded on the DOM yet, then it can cause some issues.
Oh, okay.
But you can avoid that by including the word defer, because it kind of like defers your JavaScript files from running until everything load. And you can also use DOM content loaded, which is the common pattern we teach here. So we'll also do some of that as well. So my file is called index.js. So I'm going to change this to index.js. How do I link this? What's the syntax for linking it to my index.js file?
Index.js.
Just like this? Let me get rid
Yeah,
of it.
it's in the same. In the same folder.
I think you need this, but maybe you don't.
I think I did it without.
It works? All right. You can experiment it. And if I did want to do the DOM content loaded stuff, how would I do that? So you can add an event listener to the document. Yeah. And what will be the event? DOM content loaded. So that's just another way to make sure everything's loaded on the page. And then what does it take as its arguments? What does any event listener take as its arguments? A callback. How would I write this callback? All right, we'll write it as an arrow function. We'll go over this. Yeah, that is an anonymous arrow function. So I'm going to put a console log here to see if it comes up in my console, because if it does, then we know that this file was successfully connected. So what should we say? Hello world. And now, if I refresh the page, I'm getting hello world. So that's how you can check that your files are connected. All right. So let's go over fundamentals. Let's go over
Can you go back to the index.html?
this.
No, the index.html.
Yes. And I can see if this works too. Let's find out. Yeah, that still works. Are we good?
No, hold on.
If you wrap all of your JavaScript code inside of DOM content loaded, it doesn't really matter where you put your script tag. And we don't really like global variables. So you're probably going to want to wrap all your code in some kind of function anyway. So this is one way you could do it. All right, so let's go over functions. How do I write a JavaScript function? All right. Sorry, that was Tony returning my book. So we have a function. What do we want to call it? It doesn't matter. We're just writing a function. What do we want to pass in? Let's just pass in 2 strings and concatenate them or something. How about that? Then what? What's the syntax? And then I want to concatenate the 2 strings. You could do that. You do. And then? So we can just put the other one. Cool. All right. So we test it. Is there anything missing? Turn it. All right. Let's test it. So our function is called hello world. What happened? Let me try to call it here. It doesn't work. That's strange. Maybe it's not connecting well. Which parentheses? Yeah. Let's do that. But when I tried it in the console, that should have. There we go. So this is writing a function declaration, right? Can I do this? Will this still work? Why? Hoisting. Who understands hoisting? What do you guys know about hoisting?
Well,
What do you got this? All right.
alright, so basically, let me tell you the analogy that I got. It was basically, so, say for example, if you have a parent, right, who goes to the grocery store, and they have, let's say, they buy some cookies.
Mm-hmm.
The child inside is able to get those cookies because it's their child. And when they put it in the pantry, they have access to those cookies. Whereas the child inside, where the function is, if they save their hard-earned money and buy some cookies, they can't really, they're not going to have, they don't have to share, they're not going to be able to share it to the parent because it's their.
Isn't that to do with scope, though?
Yes.
That sounds more of like a scope explanation. Okay. So,
Is it like just a two-phase thing?
Yeah, the way.
exactly, it's a
Where you
two-phase
have like
thing. Exactly.
a creation phase and then an execution phase.
Exactly. Okay, so what happens if I do this? Actually, I like labeling my arguments. So as in putting a label for what this is going to print out so that I know exactly what's being printed out. What's going to happen? Forget this for a second. What is going to console log to the console? Undefined.
Banana.
Good. Okay. What about now?
Banana.
Okay. And what if I had them like this? What is going to console log? Banana undefined. I'm hearing bananas.
I think it still works.
Banana undefined.
When it goes through it the first time, it just makes the placeholder, it doesn't give it the value yet.
Mm-hmm.
So then when it goes through it the second time, it's hitting that console.
Mm-hmm. Let me try this with let. This is a fun example. Okay. Yes. So the thing about hoisting is when you declare any variables, you perform any functions, anything like that, your code actually makes multiple passes. So the first time, like when your program compiles, it's going to run through top to bottom, and it's going to take anything that has like var, let, or const, and it's going to remember what these variables are, but it's not going to assign them. So it's just going to declare them, but not assign them, as if you're doing this. This is declaring a variable and letting it be undefined. So every time your program encounters like var, let, const on the first pass, it's going to remember what the variable names are, but it's not going to assign the values. They're going to be undefined. So that's why we were able to see undefined here.
So you're saying that it runs through it like twice. The first time it declares all the variables. The second time it goes.
The second time it assigns them. Right. So that's with var, let, const. With anything that starts with the word function, it actually remembers the entire function. So it actually remembers what this entire function hello world is and what it does on the first pass. So I'm running through my program. These things are undefined. This is a function that it remembers. And then on the second pass, it actually executes everything. So even though this code appears above where I've declared the function, I can actually still execute the hello world function, and it knows what this is. So that's how I can see hello world. And the thing about let and const, if you have something like this with var, you don't get any error, it's undefined. But let and const really don't like this, which is why we encourage you to use let and const. It's actually going to throw you a loud error as opposed to silent error. So that's why let and const are good. Now, there's another way of writing a function in JavaScript, and I'm not talking about arrow functions, but just like a different way of writing this function. Does anyone know what it is?
Expression.
So how would I do that?
You just const.
I'm
Instead of
gonna-
variable.
Exactly. So you can actually write a variable equal to a function. So you can do something like var hello world. Yes, Josh?
I mean, you can write the function in different ways, but what's, I guess, best practice? Because these are kind of like helper methods, right? So is this something that's like, better readability-wise to write it this way, or would you just say like?
It's personal preference. I think it's better to do function declarations because I think it's neater to have all of your like helper functions together and then maybe call your functions even before they're defined. So that way you have a place where you have all of your functions, but then you have a different part in your program, maybe in the beginning where you're actually executing the code to do what you want it to do. And that's something we'll see as we start building this mini app. So what's going to happen with this? What are we going to see in our console? Are we going to see hello world? Well, let me get rid of this. Oh. It's so much brighter here. Let me plug in. Okay. So why am I getting this? You know? So this is the same thing to do with hoisting. It is a function, it's here. But we tried to execute this code before this got hoisted.
So we have to move that up.
So if you have this above, it should work. Right. So that's the whole thing with the hoisting and the two passes. On the first pass of your program is going to define all of these variables, but it's not going to assign them to any value. And this is just going to be treated as a regular variable because it starts with var. So it's going to have an undefined variable called hello world. It's not going to assign it to this function. So you can't try to use the function before. But anything that starts with the function keyword, that's a function declaration, like we had it the old way. Actually, this way, you can actually use the function before it's declared. So that's why this works. Cool? All right. Callbacks. You guys comfortable with callbacks? All right, let's go over callbacks. Actually, before we go over callbacks, let's convert this to an arrow function. How would you write this as an arrow function?
String 1, string 2.
This doesn't have the function keyword. I don't think you can actually write an arrow function unless it's an expression. Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen it. Okay, so how do I convert this to an arrow function? Like, what's the formula to convert it to an arrow function? Ka?
You can remove the function and the hello.
Yeah, you remove the function keyword and this.
You could remove the curly braces too and the return.
So these.
Yeah.
Let's not do that yet. There's something else we need. We need the arrow. Where does the arrow go? I move too fast. I give things away. Okay. So this is the very simple formula of converting a regular function to an arrow function. You remove the word function and you replace it with the arguments. And then you put an arrow afterward. If we have just one argument, then you can actually remove the parentheses. But if you have no arguments, you have to have the parentheses. Or if you have multiple arguments, you have to have the parentheses. So this right now is an arrow function.
So all it does is, so that's the same thing as the function.
It's exactly the same thing.
Just another way to.
It's just another way of writing this function. That's how you convert a regular function from an arrow function. So next time you're like, oh, I feel comfortable writing a regular function, but I have to like memorize how to do an arrow function. Just remember. This is something called Lyra code. It's called like Lyra code that you can put in your Atom.
How much using it?
Right next to
Thank you.
You can look into it. I'm sure there's stuff for Atom that you can download that makes stuff like this happen. I also have a few other things like triple equals turns into this for me.
Oh, so it's just
Greater than or equal to turns into that. There's something called ligatures that you can get. Fun times.
Y'all should get ES.
Huh?
I was saying everyone should get ES.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
It also just really helps you like it'll say if something is a fatal error, so you don't have to worry about you forgot forgot a like curly brace somewhere or something like that. And you don't know what
Yeah. So, back to what Ka was saying. How do we turn this into a one-line function?
you could do it in just one line of code. You could get rid of the return and the curly braces.
Exactly. So anytime you have one line of code, you just have one line that should return something. That's where you can get rid of the curlies and the return keyword. But you can't combine them. You also have to be really careful with objects. Like for instance, if I actually wanted this to return an object with like key value pairs, it would confuse the hell out of this program because it would think I'm opening a block of code. So you can't do this kind of notation with objects unless you wrap an object in parentheses. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're like, I want to return an object in one line, but it's not working. That's what's happening.
Can you just repeat one? When does the return implicit?
So if you just have one thing that you're trying to return, you can remove the curly braces that open this block of code, and you can remove the return keyword.
Okay, only if you're returning one.
It wouldn't really work with multiple lines. I mean, we don't want to write multiple lines of code in one line. It would be kind of weird. So that would be the use case. So we get rid of this. But you can't do one thing and not the other. Like you can't just take out the return, or you can't just take out the curlies.
Pick up both.
Yeah, you have to take out both for this to work. So now, it still works, right? So that's how we convert a regular function to an arrow function. They're nothing to be afraid of. Now let's go over callbacks. So you guys remember how in Ruby, you had something like an array, and you have like a dot map, and then you open like a block of code, and you're like element, and you say how you want to map this over, like how you want to transform each thing. You do like element +2 or something. How would we do this in JavaScript? Like, think about how you can transform your Ruby logic into doing the same exact thing, but in JavaScript.
Would you just use an element analysis function after that?
Exactly. So I have this array, I have my dot map, then what?
Like parentheses,
Mm-hmm.
the curly braces, all you define like each element and the array.
Yeah. So let's actually write a regular old function, the old way. What does it take as a parameter? Anyone?
Yeah, like number.
Exactly. And then?
Number plus 2 will return.
Mm-hmm.
Number plus 2.
Exactly. And we could actually have this somewhere on the outside if we wanted to. Which is probably the way that it was introduced to you guys. Like maybe if you have let function.
So if we wanted to convert that to an arrow function, you just take away function, keep number, and then just do +2.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll do that part too.
Oh.
So if you didn't want to, if this is confusing right now, which I totally understand if it might be confusing to see it that way, you can just put a callback in here. So things like map or filter take a callback. So they take another function. That other function takes in a parameter. That parameter represents every one of these elements one at a time as you're going through your array, and it tells you what you want to do with it if it's a map.
Could you rewrite that real quick with the arrow function?
We'll get to it. I can do it. I'll do it now. How do we write this as an arrow function?
Just put number
Mm-hmm.
and the arrow key. Oh, like, yeah, and then do number plus 2.
So like that. Or on one line. How would we do this on one line?
Could be backticks.
So with one line, and I'll keep all of this just in case you guys want to see it later. I remove the curlies, right? And I get rid of the return and I just put on one line. So now this function does this.
So
They're all the same.
We would use like 21 to 23 if it's more than one line.
Yes, exactly. So what the dot map does in JavaScript is it takes a callback. That callback takes a parameter that represents each one of these things, and then dot map will call this function on every single one of these elements one at a time, and it's going to return a new array. So if we console log the result of this, let's see what happens. So now we have our transformed array, right? But it's really the same thing as just copy and pasting an actual function into this. So you actually can put function, and that is frequently what you're going to do, because usually when you use things like map or filter, you're only going to use it that one time, so you usually do write just an anonymous function there. Don't forget your returns, because every single function in JavaScript needs to return something, except for each. So since this is a function too, that function needs to return something. So you're returning some transformation of that element, right? So let's see if it works. So it still works, right? But if we want to be more succinct, we can just put this all in one line, because this itself is a function. So we can get rid of all of this nonsense. We can just put that, because this itself is a function. And this is frequently how you're going to use stuff like map. Make sense? Should we do a filter? Let's do a filter. Okay. So let's do another array. How should we filter this array? Which numbers do we want to keep? Keep all even? You want to keep all odds? Okay, let's keep the even numbers. All right, so how do I write a dot filter? Okay, array dot filter, and then Woody, what does dot filter take as an argument? A callback. And what does that callback, what does that function take as an argument? Yeah, so it's gonna take a singular thing of each element of the array. So we're not actually taking an array though. We're taking the things in the array. Exactly. Yeah, so I wouldn't actually want to call it an array, but maybe like an element in the array, or a number. Or sometimes you'll see things like L. It stands for element. So you can do something like that. And then what?
After that, we're going to say
L?
yeah, that's something else.
Mm-hmm.
L. Module.
Okay, anything else that we need? We always, always, always need return. So let's see what happens. Maybe console log this whole thing. This is actually a little sloppy. I'm just gonna call this result so that we can see it more easily. It works. All right, cool. Let's write something. Actually, how do we convert this to one line? Mm-hmm. So right now this is an arrow function, and then exactly. That's it. There's something else we can take out too. You can take out this. Because if it's one argument, you can just take it out. This is the same thing. So start to like get comfortable transforming a regular old function into an arrow function like this. It can be very jarring to look at it, but once you like understand how the two can be converted from one to the other, it's going to get easier. Let's make sure this still works. All right. Let's do something more complex. Let's write a function that takes in an array, and we're going to either map it or filter it. Let's do our filter. and we want to do this function. So we want to filter our array by even numbers. So now instead of just doing it on the outside, we want to do it inside the function.
Can you just copy that line from where it says array all the way into the
This?
copy that, change array to AR. And put return.
You can. So that's the cool thing. You can return this entire thing, which will return the result of this filter. Can we do the whole thing on one line? Yeah? Sarah says yeah. Well, is this one line? Yeah. So we can do the whole thing on one line. How do we do the whole thing on one line?
You get rid of the brackets and return. And you could also get rid of the function. Or
We do want to get rid of this.
okay.
So that means we probably want to name our variable something.
And then you put an arrow between the two.
Yes. And we need to set this equal to this function. And we can get rid of this if we wanted to. So this is something you can do in JavaScript. It looks weird, but you can do weird stuff like this. And it still works. So if I console log so this is a function that returns this. But variables can store functions inside of them. Yeah, that's why functions are so powerful in JavaScript. They're like considered first-class citizens. They can return other functions, they can take functions as parameters. You can do really weird stuff. Like for instance, you can write a function that takes in another function and invokes it on something. Or if you wanted to, you can write a function that takes in an array of functions and then invokes all of those functions on something. You could do really weird stuff. So this would work, but how do I call this to make it work? Jeff?
You just say filter array, right?
Mm-hmm.
Parentheses to call it.
Exactly. So this might seem very unusual because we think this is a variable, I can't call a variable, but it is really representing a function, so we can invoke this as long as we pass it the argument that it needs. So we can pass it something like this. And let's just make it even numbers this time, or odd numbers, and see what happens. Okay, fine. There we go. And why was I able to do just this?
Because if it's not zero, it's true.
Exactly. Good. All right, let's move on. Fun times. Are we ready for the DOM? Are we a little bit clearer on functions? Just a little bit, maybe?
A little bit.
But you're really... What's going on over there? Guys. This isn't a bar.
Slapping the dom.
Good. Okay. Okay. So now, let's load some stuff on the DOM. Let's say I have an array of students. Or do we want to use dogs, or do we want to use something else? Like, what do we want to build here?
Monkeys.
Huh?
Monkeys.
Monkeys?
Pokemon. But I want a different animal. Too many dogs.
Weren't we tired of Pokemon?
I'm tired of cats and dogs.
Food.
What about zoo animals?
No, squirrels.
We doing
Squirrels.
Squirrels?
Squirrels.
Food? Let's just
Squirrels.
desserts.
Squirrels are going.
Let's do zoo
You
animals.
don't go to a zoo to see a squirrel.
Why not?
Okay.
Unless it's like a 20-foot squirrel.
So let's start with
Squirrels in Korea are small, tiny. Like chipmunks.
You should catch my brain back.
okay, so let's do something like this.
It's like multiple.
Kevy Webby, the what? What is Kevy Webby?
Squirrel. 20-foot squirrel.
Bird. Alright, who's a squirrel? Gerald. The squirrel. What else?
Simon the squid.
Simon
Or
the
no, the
squid.
jellyfish.
Too late.
Tara's an elephant, bro. She's an elephant.
One more.
It's not.
Wizard?
Yeah,
It's
just like to see.
Did I spell your name right? Alright, cool. So, dum. Where do we want to put these animals on our HTML? Every time you want to add something to the DOM, you have to make sure there's some space for it to inject it. Like put it into some kind of div or something, right? So where do we want to put this on the DOM? Because right now we don't really have a good container for it.
Let's make it div.
Let's make a div.
See what happens.
Do we want to give this div any kind of ID name or something?
Yeah.
There's a fun trick. No. No squirrels. Zoo animals. There you go.
How you play it, bro?
So you can do stuff like that. You can do, for instance, if I wanted a class name, so if I had a class called student, you can do stuff like that.
Is that just for Samara?
I don't know.
Wait,
You probably
Or
can,
for Adam?
I think it's a package.
Uh,
I think it's Emmet, maybe? The Emmet package, E-M-M-E-T. Or you can just Google Emmet Atom package and see what the Sublime or Atom equivalent is. Alright, so now we have a handy dandy div to put our zoo animals into. What I want to accomplish is have a bunch of li elements that have each of these animals with their names. So how would I do that? I want to go through each of these animals, and for each of these animals, I want to put an li in the div so you can see the name and the animal. I don't believe in ULs. I don't believe in ULs. I never use them. I just put my naked LIs and they work. Okay? On what? Zoo animals. And then, this is a callback. How do callbacks work? This is why we went over callbacks. What does for each take as an argument? Codes and I?
What do you take as an argument?
Yes. A callback, a function. Good. Function. What does that function take as an argument?
An element.
Exactly, an element in that array. Then what? Now what happens?
come on.
Let's just... Why don't we just console log, just to make sure we're getting something. I'm going to label my argument. Let's just make sure that this actually works. Yay! Something's working, right? Okay. So I console logged each of these elements, and they're coming out. So that's good. This function is working. Now we can move on. What do we want to do? So create an li.
Nice.
We could actually use const. I actually heard a good rule of thumb is always use const unless you absolutely know you're going to have to reassign something. So we can actually use const for this. How do I create this element?
What if you don't know you need to reassign something, but you use constant? Wouldn't you safely use let? Change
No.
it.
I don't know.
You can, because you constantly.
Oh, changes, go back to your code.
Go back to the code and change it. Alright guys, stay on track. Cut deny the wizard, stay on track. Alright, so how do I create a new element?
Document, create element.
What do I give this as an argument? Like this?
Yes.
Okay. And then, do you want to just console log and see how this works? Actually, there's this cool thing that I downloaded the other day. Let me see if I can figure it out. Wait. Is it? No! No! There's this cool package that I downloaded that I can just highlight a variable and then hit console log and it console logs it. I think it's... I don't know. I'll have to look into it. Oh, I think it's Shift Q. Okay. I'll deal with that later. So that's what these things look like. What do we want inside the LI?
The animal name.
How do I add that? Simon? Gerald?
Is it like element? No. Never mind.
You have to use the LI.
Is it
Oh, element. Oh.
li dot inner HTML?
And then?
Equals to element.
Okay. We never console logged this. It's working. We're getting our LIs, right? What's the difference between inner HTML and inner text?
I just know, like, when you do inner text, like, you can't use tags.
Yes, exactly. So remember how with HTML you can have nested stuff like this? So if you ever had a situation where you wanted to create an entire div and you wanted to put a bunch of nested stuff in there, like maybe what you guys were doing with the Pokemon or whatever, you can do .inner HTML on that div and put everything. All the HTML that goes in that div. Yeah, it's really useful. Okay. But how do I put this on the DOM?
What did you say?
For what?
Just put all of them on.
Inner HTML versus inner text? So we'll get into that as well. But basically with inner HTML, say I had something like a div. Say instead of an li, I had a div. I can do that div.inner HTML, and I can set it equal to a bunch of HTML that will all go inside of that div. A whole block. Like maybe a UL with a bunch of LIs inside it. Maybe an H1 inside that div.
When you do that, though, can you put, like, variables? Like,
You can, and we'll actually get to that example as part of this. So don't worry about this right now, but we'll get to it. That's why we're building this from small incremental things and getting bigger and bigger. What about inner text? What is inner text for?
For the text, just the text.
Yeah, it's just, inner text is just for text that you want to put inside the tags. And in this situation, it's more accurate to use inner text since we're not trying to inject any HTML tags. So we can do inner text and we get this. So I have my LIs. How do I put them on the page?
Since you're gonna put each elements, gonna be plus equals for the element.
Not yet. So this is just to put the name inside the li tag. So we're not plus equal here. Maybe if we had a div, we can plus equals each one of these onto it. What do we need? Kadzai the wizard.
No idea.
So don't get lost yet. It's too early to get lost.
I should know what's going on.
You know everything that's going on?
No, I said should I?
Yes.
Okay. I know.
So we have an array of zoo animals. This is stuff like we learned in Ruby, just creating an array. All we've done so far is made a for each on that array. So now for each of these elements, we're making just a little li element, just a small baby one, like this.
Okay.
So this part of the code just creates that element and nothing but that element.
Alright.
So right now we have 5 of them because there's 5 things in the array. So for each one, it just created this little li element, nothing inside it. Now we want to put something inside it. So now we're going to manipulate this li element and give it an inner text property and set it equal to the string of each of these in the array, right? So now all of our li elements have this little string inside. That's all we've done.
Okay. So alright, I'm on board.
Okay, good.
Cool.
That's where I need you to be.
Alright.
So now we want to put all of these li's on the DOM. And remember, our index.html file, all it has right now is just a div called zoo animals. And our goal is to put each one of these li's inside of the zoo animals div. Like that. So what do we need to do to make that happen? Josh? We can append it, but append it to where? So we need to append the li, but to something else.
Well, what do we,
To this thing.
what do we have on the ID?
Zoo animals is the ID.
It's that tag we have.
Exactly. So we need to grab this little container in order to put all of our li's into it. So to do that, we can just set it as a variable, right? So it can be like const, what do we want to call it? Zoo container? Okay, let's call it cage. I love that.
That's it then.
Okay. So how do we grab it? And this is something that you can practice on the browser side. Yeah, you can practice this here to make sure you're actually grabbing the right thing. So you can be like document dot what?
Query selector.
I love that idea.
Actually, because I don't know what's next. Let's do select element by ID.
Let's do query selector.
Okay.
I want all of you to be comfortable with query selector. I don't think you need to know 5 different ways of grabbing things off the DOM. I think one way is enough, and I think that way is query selector.
We can do everything.
One way
Because you can do everything with query selector.
Everything we do with query selector.
Yeah,
You
everything.
don't need to know anything else.
No, you don't need to know anything else for the code challenge, except possibly query selector all.
Okay.
Because if, for instance, you had an array of a bunch of li's or something and you wanted to grab all of them, then you would want to do query selector all. And if you did just query selector, it would only grab the first one.
Alright, let's move it here. Alright. Query selector.
So
Josh.
query selector, can you go over like the syntax for, you know, if we have an ID, or like how does it know
Exactly,
if it's a class?
exactly. So with query selector, it takes an argument of a string. Inside of that string, you can put a tag name. So if I put h1, I have a tag name h1. So I get this. Another thing I could put inside of query selector is an ID. If I put an ID, I have to put the hashtag in front of it. It's always going to be inside of a string. So What did we have? Zoo animals. So now I can grab zoo animals. Is this too small? And if I had like a class name? Exactly. So I can put a period in front of whatever the thing is. And this is enough to get you by. You don't need anything else.
What's the period do again?
It lets you grab class names. Actually, usually with class names, that means you have multiple elements with that class name, so you'd want to do query selector all.
We're gonna find ourselves in a situation where you gotta find like an item inside a class or whatever. Because I know that you can do multiple items, right?
Yes, you can. If you want, we can go over that real quick. So, say for example, I already had these li elements here. So I have Jane. Who else wants to be an li? Josh. And let's have Jeff. All the J's. Alright. So we have this. How do I grab all of these LIs? And then? LI. Is this an array?
No. Array like.
Who thinks it's an array?
It's a bonus.
You guys are too clever. So, do you guys know about using type of to determine the type of something in JavaScript? I literally use this all the time to find bugs because sometimes you don't expect a certain type to be a certain type. So if you give it some kind of value like type of 5, it's going to tell you that's a number. If you give it a string, it's going to tell you that's a string. If you give it an array, it's going to tell you object, which is deceptive because arrays are considered objects in JavaScript, and an object is also an object. So we don't really want to use type of with arrays. What you can use is array dot is array and give it an array or something that's not an array. So if you give array dot is array an array, it'll tell you that it's an array. Since we have this, let's check if this is an array. Who thinks it's going to say it's an array and who thinks it's not? Who votes array? No one. Okay. It's not an array. It's an array-like object. So what that means is you might not be able to do certain functions on this that you can do with an array. So you can do for each on it, which is good. But you can't do like map, you can't do other array-like things. So it's just something to be aware of. I think especially because things like get elements by tag name. So if I were to do document.get elements by tag name.
Can you call it dirt on
Yeah, why not? So if I were to get my documents by tag name, is this an array? It's not an array. But there's an even bigger problem. It doesn't even have for each on it. So if you ever find yourself in a situation like this where you've grabbed some kind of HTML collection and you don't know how to iterate over it, you can always force it back into an array by doing array from. But you probably won't really find yourself in this situation. But now it's a real array and I can use all the array methods on it, like for each. Okay. So we've grabbed all of these. Query selector. What if I want to grab the things inside of the div called zoo animals? Like how can I combine that ID with the tag? because you can also do that with query selector, and it can be very useful in certain situations. Say I had other LIs in a different div, but I didn't want to get all of the LIs. I only wanted to get the LIs in the zoo animals div. How would I do that? So, start me off, Josh. But what about with query selector?
Oh, okay. So query selector. Parentheses. And you want to put it inside some quotes. Then you use the hash. And then put the ID. Oh.
And then?
Close it. Put another parentheses. Another quote. And then
So there's actually, I can combine stuff together. That's why it's useful. That someone asked me this question. That was you. Yeah, so you can combine this stuff together. It can be very powerful.
So you just use a space.
You can use a space and you can put other stuff after it. So now I'm grabbing all of the LIs in the zoo animals ID div.
What's a zoo animal? This.
Zoo animal ID is here, and that's a div.
So you just added change JavaScript.
Yeah, so for example, say I had a button here too. So say I have this button, and I just want to grab all of the LIs in this div and not the button. Then I can do something like that. Right? Because if I did just zoo animals, it's going to grab the whole div. So that's like if you want to get more specific about attaching specific event listeners, it can come in handy. Just remember that if you were to do just query selector without query selector all, it would return the first thing. So see how it's already highlighting for me what it's going to give me.
Yeah.
So now it only gives me the first.
But if you do all and then you take away the LI, then it's gonna get that whole list. So I'm just like,
I don't know what's going to happen. I think it's going to give me an array with the zoo animals div in it as the only element. That's my guess. Yeah.
okay.
Because we didn't tell it LI, we just told it the thing called zoo animals. Okay. But we want to put this on the DOM. We don't have it on the DOM already. So let's get back to the task at hand. We want to put all of these LIs onto that zoo animals div. We've grabbed the zoo animals div. How did we do that again? Query selector. And then, what does that take as a parameter?
ID or class. ID was hash.
So always as a string.
Zoo animals.
Exactly. So now we've grabbed this element. That means now we can manipulate it. We can put stuff into it. We can take stuff out of it. We can remove it from the DOM. We can do whatever we want to this element. That's why it's called manipulating the DOM. So now that we've tested that this works, and we've tested in the browser, we know we have the right element. We can put this in our code. We can set our cage equal to this. Now we have a cage. And if we want to prove it, we can console log the cage. Or if we really want to, we can console dir the cage. There's our cage. All right. So we have the cage. We have the LIs. We've made an LI for everything in this list, and we've given it some inner text. Now the last step is putting it into the cage. How do we do that? Kudzanai. You know this. We haven't lost you yet.
No, not yet.
Good. We're not going to tonight. That's the point.
Right? So, and
You can append MI to K.
Yes. There we go. Boom! You passed the code challenge.
Oh, what?
If you can do this,
You passed.
What?
there's gonna be more. It's gonna be a little more involved. But if you get this basic concept of having an array of objects or some other kinds of stuff in it, making an element, putting it on the DOM, you understand Ajax. Yes, Gerald?
I'm having the issue we had earlier today.
Mm-hmm.
On caught type error, cannot read property of null. Even
Yes.
though I wrote on the top document.add eventlistener DOM.
Okay.
So why is it like that?
So you're probably trying to append something to something that doesn't exist. Because when you get errors like that trying to append to null, that means that thing that you're trying to append to is null.
Okay, so
Did you declare your cage?
yeah, const cage is equal to document.selector. Oh, that's why.
There you go. Good job. Right. Let's move on.
Yes.
Triumph! Okay.
I'm done.
Okay.
I can go home.
You can go home.
Alright, guys. So this is the basic itty bitty piece of it. If you understand this, we can build on top of this. Now, instead of just strings, let's have our array be objects. Right? That's the kind of stuff we deal with databases. So let's have our zoo animals actually be an array of objects. So let's refactor this a little bit. What kind of properties do we want each of these objects to have?
Name, species.
Name. Alright, so let's do like name Kevy Webby. Okay, let's do species. What else? Number of legs? Okay. Alright, how many? 2?
So
Well, let's do hobby. Flying. And then let's do one more. Let's do image. Because image is stuff you're going to have to deal with. So this is the fun part. Now we can look up an image. What kind of bird, guys?
He's an ostrich.
Kevin.
Ostrich. I like ostrich. Alright, the key is not to pick one that's too big. Which one? This is too big. It's going to be too big. Let's do this one. This one? Let's do this one. Okay. This is our image of Kevy Webby. We got one object. Who's next? Let's copy this. So then we have Gerald the squirrel. Do you guys need a break?
Sure.
You want to take a break? I'll do this part because this is very manual labor, and you guys get the idea of how to make objects. Take a short break. You guys seem like you're losing steam. All right, take a break, and you'll be surprised by the images I choose.
What else do you have? What is? So, not type of not a number
Is number.
Makes no sense. It's not a number.
Yeah, I know.
You're taking it too literally.
Welcome to JavaScript. Why is type of null object? Who knows? It's JavaScript. I don't know. All right, Gerald the squirrel. How many legs do squirrels have? 4. Hobby. Oh, this is a cute squirrel. Ooh, I like this one. It's kind of big.
It's in the one on the right, bottom right. You can pick up.
This one?
Right.
I don't know my rights and lefts. This one? It's too big. Look at that, 1280 pixels. Let's do the European squirrel. Maybe this one. It's a cute one. Alright, I'm wasting too much time on squirrels. Oh, since I'm doing this, I want to remember how this package works. It's Control-Shift-Q, plot twist. It's a fun package, so you can do stuff like Control-Shift-Q. No. Control-Shift-Q. And it console out there.
Wait, what is the package?
It's a Sublime package called Console Wrap. Maybe there's an Atom equivalent. I don't know. Gigi told me about it because she used to use Sublime. Jonathan, how are you feeling about all this?
I actually feel better now. Like, I was pretty stressed because I didn't know like where I was.
Mm-hmm.
But I think this definitely like reinforces me.
Good. I don't know what level you guys are at. I know Woody's got this. Ka, how are you feeling about this? Can I trust you?
I'll be good once I review this. Like, this is super.
Good.
I think I was just confused because I knew too many bits and pieces and I did not connect.
So that's why we're connecting it all. Simon, the squid. How many legs do squids have? Just gonna put 8. Squidding around. Is this a thing? Then we have Tara. What's your stomping around? Ooh, that's a beautiful helmet. Too big. Oh, that's a cute one. Is it your favorite animal?
It's not very
And then we have Kusanai the wizard. I mean, is it weird that my students are going in a cage? Like, it's something weird going on. Let's find a good one. Kusanai. Actually, let's do Kingsley Shackle. He's a good choice. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yes. Is that racist? He's gonna get offended. Isn't he?
No, he won't.
Huh?
No, this is funny.
Change the hobby though.
Minister of Magic.
This is post Voldemort age.
Okay. guys are still taking a break.
Wait, what's Gerald the squirrel? Let me see. Let me see.
You'll see. You'll find out. You'll be surprised.
No. That's the shit I'm gonna be thinking about. Y'all gonna hit me in the middle of a code challenge.
I really like that. You not like football. That happen? You hear that?
Yo, let me get tight at me. Okay.
Ask them on.
What up?
Code challenge. Slap it every time. Just saying that shit. Every time. Slap it.
You should every time that you're putting something in the DOM, console log slapping them all the time. And then look at your code and look in the console and be like, why is it? Nah, you should.
I'm feeling about you.
Better.
Slap it up.
Okay, I didn't know.
You ever seen This is definitely a gift.
You still recording right now?
Oh,
I think she's still recording.
Hey, cop. I'd hire you, bro. I would hire you, bro.
I was not.
Yeah.
I don't know why you worry about that. You want to do that. And you smile, you know what the fuck you're doing. So.
See, I couldn't push it like this. I couldn't push it like this in our group chat.
I've seen you work, bro.
I think if I constantly slap it on his eye.
So,
Type of gifts.
I know. You're the person I wanted, even if it wasn't my company. Yo,
It's
not like
you.
you.
Like,
Are you guys ready to get back into it?
You stopped recording?
Huh?
Were you recording the whole time?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Kutanai and Josh, I want you guys in the front of the.
Oh, where? Wow. It's like that?
It's like that.
Get them.
I don't want you to get disengaged and feel like you're getting lost. The whole point of this is for you to get this stuff.
I got it.
Good. All right. So, during our intermission, let's make sure I'm still recording. I think I am. During our intermission, I have made an array of objects. They have a species, a name, number of legs, a hobby, and an image. So now, I don't know. I didn't know the answer to that.
Because squirrel has 10 legs.
Is it really that important, guys? Now you're just distracting.
Oh, it's squid.
All right. So, since we've changed our array, what do we want to do here? Because this is no longer, element is no longer a string. It's an object now. Okay, we can do that. But, then what? I mean, do you want to see
Instead
what?
of element over there, it's object name.
Like this?
Yeah.
If you're not certain, and I figured out how my thing works, so prepare to be amazed. Figured out how my package works. It's a faster way to console log. This is Kingsley Shacklebolt. Don't get offended, please. You'll see. He's a wizard from Harry Potter who became Minister of Magic. I was gonna make you Harry Potter, but then I thought that would be racist, so I made you Kingsley. But then I thought maybe that would be racist. I know. So, if in doubt, just console log what you're dealing with. We're dealing with an object that looks like this. Each one of the things in our array is an object. This is like dealing with JSON, remember? Dealing with APIs. We have an array of objects. For each object, we're creating an LI, and the inner text of that LI is object.name. So name is a key in each of these objects, and its value is a string, right? If we want, we could even do something like put our other thing that we had before. Something like that. Good? Now works. We've put everything on the DOM. We have our array of stuff. Now, let's attach an event listener so that when you click on one of these things, a div appears down here that represents that object and tells you some information about it. Like has the name, the species, legs, hobby, and the image. Fun times. How do we attach an event listener? Yes, to what do we want to attach the event listener?
Do we want to do this with delegation or not?
I don't believe in delegation.
Is it to the div?
It's to each one of these things. So when you click one of these things, the thing appears. Ka. Exactly. So we have our li here. So how do we add the event listener? Good. What does add event listener take as its arguments? So the action, what do you mean by action? Shh. Yes, so that's like the event that happened, like the click event. And then what's the second argument? Yes, so it's a function. What if we wanted to write this as an arrow function? What's the formula to turn a function into an arrow function? So get rid of the function word. And then after the arguments, which there are none, just do that. That's it. And we can do that here too, right? Get rid of the function keyword. We can get rid of these parentheses since there's one argument. And we can put an arrow there. How come we don't have a return in for each? Remember how I was always harping about having a return? And stuff like this. How come for each doesn't take a return? Yeah, we're only using for each to make stuff. So I came up with this analogy once. Most of the time functions need to return something in JavaScript, and you think of it as like a recipe. So you do all this stuff in the function, and in the end you return a result. Like you return the cake that you've just made with that recipe. But then there's other types of functions which are more rare, things like for each, where you don't really return anything. It's like cleaning your house. You give it all of the instructions for cleaning your house, and you don't really need to return anything. You have a clean house in the end. So for each is one of those things where you don't need to return anything. You just tell it what you want it to do. So what do we want to do in our event listener? Create a div? Okay, what do we want to name it? Okay, sure. So how do we create the div? Yes. Info div. And then? Good. So now what goes in the div? Let's make a div that looks like, all right, I like this idea. I like having an info div. Let's actually have it ready-made here. I think that would make things a little bit easier and would be closer to what you guys actually have to deal with. So this already exists. We don't actually need to create this. We can just grab this and append stuff into it. So let's just do it that way instead. And the kind of thing that I want to have inside here is like an H1 or something that says the name, and then maybe an H2 that says, or maybe like name the animal. So like Kevy Webby the bird, and then we can have legs, and we can have something like hobby, and then we can have image. So this is what I'm looking for in my div. The div exists, but this stuff inside doesn't exist. ¿Qué pasó? Alright. Make sense? So how do we actually grab this div?
Div const div is equal to document.get document.create selector. String. And then in there we would put a hash and info div.
Good. It's not defined.
Did you save it?
Maybe not. It's possible. Only one way to find out.
You have to reload.
It's possible. Let me get rid of this. There we go. So now that we've confirmed on our browser that this works, we can safely put this variable in our code. Okay, now what? How do we put all this stuff inside it?
So do info div dot HTML.
Yes, this is the use case for it.
And you just throw in all the stuff.
Exactly. That's exactly what we're going to do. So now, you can just put all of this inside it. And if you use backticks, you can interpolate the variables that we need, right? So what do we want to put in here? And then? This is what we want. What do we want in here? Okay. And continue. What do we want in here?
Where is that coming from? It's gotta be a link to the image. Does object have?
Yes,
So it would
exactly.
be so yeah, it would be an interpolation of object.image.
Okay, so we're appending this.
Okay.
Did I spell it wrong? Shall we see if it works? So I click one. What happened?
They're calling inner HTML info.
Ah. Boom. That's dumb. If you get this, you get the code challenge.
No, what did he do? Okay. What did he do? Okay.
This all we did. We just put the HTML here.
Nice.
And so, huh?
Click on the others.
Mine is boring.
He's badass. So, can you follow this? Does the pieces connect? If you can do this, you're halfway done with the code challenge.
Wait, before we were done.
You're halfway done with the code challenge. It's gonna consist of you being able to slap a list of stuff on the DOM, and then maybe add some event listeners to show more info. Show some info on the DOM. It's not magic. It's just JavaScript. Woody.
You said if you put the tags on the plastics, how do you append that?
If you wanted to append all of this,
Like just two of them.
it's gonna be a pain in the ass. Because then you have to individually create each one of those elements and append those separately to this div. Which is why I think when you have a block of code that's all going into one div, it makes more sense to do the backticks and have all of the HTML as a block and assign it as the inner HTML because you know it's going inside that div. We could do it, but it'll look less clean. What's the difference between this?
Then every time you click it, there's going to be another card that's there. Or another.
So, boom, 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 boom.
Keep making heavy buttons.
Boom, 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 boom. So there are use cases for plus equals and there are use cases for just equals, and it's important that you understand when to use which.
Just getting that call.
So the plus equals is when you want to add something to the page and keep the previous stuff that was already there. So you're reassigning it to whatever was there already plus the thing that you want to add to it. And the equals is when you want to reassign it and replace whatever was there with the new thing.
Are there any other things? I don't know. Just looking for other things we can do that type of manipulation.
You can do anything.
It's really helpful on the lab.
I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. But we should get into fetch. Also, Roman asked me this. He talked about destructuring. JavaScript has some interesting things that you can do with objects, and destructuring is one of them. So you see how here it's kind of annoying to type object.species, object.name, object.species, object.hobby, all of this stuff. So if you have a function and it takes in an object, you can actually do something called destructuring to that object.
Did you make a function for that object?
You basically put curlies instead, and you put the keys separated by commas. It's kind of an annoying concept to get. I still struggle with it sometimes. But basically, this is telling JavaScript, oh, weird, you're putting these curly things instead of an argument. Okay, I trust that that means my argument is an object, and that object has these keys in it. So this literally represents the object, but separated by the keys. And now, instead of having to type object dot whatever, I can just type that thing.
Isn't that similar to like class constructors? Like, not like you said with class constructor and then like that kind of like sense.
Like in Ruby?
No.
Yeah, you can do it with class constructors too.
Kind of reminds me.
You're gonna do this in React if you're comfortable with it. Yeah. I think it's cleaner to keep it the old way because then you know exactly what you're dealing with. Let's see if this even worked. No, apparently not.
No, because you should left the wrong thing.
What?
And it's two. I needed more.
Eh. What? It's still not happy. Unexpected token 82.
It's like, yo, give it.
Yeah, it's confused. I don't know if you can actually do this with for each. Thought you could. No, it's not happy. Let's not stick to this for now. You can definitely do it with classes and like with React.
I like the other way, kind of tells you what's going where, what's coming from where.
Actually, I think what you could do, if you really wanted to do it this way, I think what you would need to do instead is declare this as a variable. So if you have object, I think you can do something like reassign object to these things. Or maybe make these things equal to the object, or something like that. What else we have? Legs, hobby, image. No? Someone write a blog post about destructuring, please, because clearly this is something I still struggle with. Yeah.
Save 2 minutes. 2 minutes for a sentence.
Okay, so we continue. Let's start fetching.
Yes.
So, right now, we're using an array of objects. Fetch is just going to allow us to get this array from somewhere else. It's not going to be readily available for us in this file. So something you could do is a JSON server, if we wanted to. You guys worked with that today, right? So you have to npm install the JSON server. You have to create a file called db.json or something like that.
We have to,
db.json.
like every time keep installing npm.
No.
Or that's just with the JSON server.
Just have to do this once because the -g means you've installed it globally, so it's always available. So I've created the db.json file. And then basically you just need to have an object inside here. And then you have to set it to something. See how they do posts? So that means you're gonna have your localhost /posts as a route that has all of your posts, and you can do like /post/ a certain ID, and then you'll have that specific ID. So the other thing to remember about JSON is everything needs to be strings, including the keys. So if I wanted to do animals, I have to put that in strings. And then I can give it my array of objects. But all of these have to be in strings. Command D.
Yeah, are you getting it though so that it doesn't just replace it with
I think that's a normal feature.
oh, is it?
This is a normal feature that sometimes I try to do in the wild, outside of Sublime, and then it doesn't work.
What are you pressing? Command D.
No,
Not copy.
just quotes.
Atom, bro. Like, doesn't it duplicate command D?
So you do need your ID numbers. So let's give these ID numbers. If you double click on something, it highlights. And if you just start typing the quotes, it turns it into a string. I thought that was normal behavior.
That's all the same.
Yeah, I get that part. You just don't want to leave it from the string. So if you highlight something in the quotations, it turns into a string.
Yeah.
Just a little more reformatting and then we're almost done. Okay. Let's see if this JSON thing works. So now we can run the server. That's not what I want.
So what is it that we're doing here? We're just trying to get these objects to run in the backend.
Just to make sure that we're running a server. So we have like some kind of database. Doesn't like my JSON. I think it's mad about this actually. Please work. Okay, so see how it's even telling me I can go to localhost 3000/animals? That means I can go to localhost 3000/animals. And I can see all of my animals. So it's like I've created an API in 5 minutes. And you can fetch from this as if it's an API. And you can go to / a particular ID number, like 2, and we get Gerald the squirrel. Cool? That's JSON. So the only thing we've done now is instead of having, well, what are you complaining about? Instead of having an array of objects that we're working with right here, now we're just gonna fetch this array of objects from somewhere else. That's it. So, where should we start? Let's make a function that allows us to fetch our animals so we can keep it contained. So all I want to do is fetch my array of animals. How do I fetch? Gerald?
Fetch. Then
What does it take?
URL. So localhost 3000.
Exactly. You can, if you want to. You don't have to. If we wanted to, we can have like let URL equals this thing and then just do fetch URL. Okay. So let's invoke this function. And remember that you can invoke it before it's declared and it'll work. So I can be like fetch animals. And let's, before we try to fetch, let's just make sure this is connected. Fetching animals. There we go. Fetching animals. So now we can start fetching. So what does fetch return? Promise. What is a promise?
Promise that they will return something once everything is done.
Yeah, because we don't want to hang up our program and it might take a while to go fetch all the stuff from the database. So what do we use with promises to then specify what we want to do after a real value is returned? Josh. Stuff that. There's also another thing that you can use called async await, which I'm not going to get into now, but for anyone who's interested, I can teach you guys how to use that one too. So we can use .then. What does .then take? It does take a response, but before we get into taking the response, it actually takes a callback first. So that callback takes a response. So how do we write a callback again?
Function.
Yeah, we just write a function. It's just a regular old ass function, right? It's just a function. That function takes arguments.
Response or yes.
Yes. Response or res, if you want, we can call it res. So whatever came out of this, when this finally finished, is what gets passed into this function. That's all it is. So if we want, we can console log it. So now what's happening is we're making a fetch request to this URL. If we don't specify, like if it's a get or a post or like what kind of request, it's going to automatically default to a get request. So this is as if we're trying to go on this web page or this API. We're making a response to this URL. And then remember that internet stuff we learned with the HTTP request response cycle? So what comes out of the response? Like what comes out after we... Well, we get like an internet response kind of thing that tells you like, was my request to this page successful or not? Yeah, it's going to have like a status code. It's going to say if the request was successful or not, all that stuff. So right here, the response that's coming out of this GET request, out of this fetch to this URL, is just that internet garbage that tells you if your request was successful or not. So if we were to console log it, you see we're getting, oh, I made a request to the animals URL. The status code was 200. Everything with a 2, successful, so good, it worked. It has other stuff in it. But this isn't really that important. We don't want this. What do we want? Exactly. So we want to give this a callback that parses it to JSON. How do we do that? Anyone?
So it's going to be response.
That's it? So you have to invoke it. So that JSON is a function on the response that you have to invoke. And we want to return this. But if we wanted to write it as an arrow function, you guys know how to convert stuff to an arrow function. Kudzenai, how do I convert this to an arrow function? You got this. That's why you're here.
You get rid of the function.
Exactly.
You put an arrow after the red.
Exactly.
You
That's
get rid
it.
of that, then you
Yeah, I can get rid of these and make it all on one line.
put it on one line.
Exactly.
Return them on.
Yeah, exactly. That's it.
Do you have to get rid of those parentheses?
No, I just think it's
It
needed.
looks nice.
Yeah, it looks nice. So, this is like chaining the promises and whatever. So fetch returns a promise. When we finally get something out of the fetch, we put that promise here, or we put that result that came out and do something else with it. So now we're... It does. So all the .thens return promises as well.
All of them?
I think so, yeah.
So if you dot then again, which is where you're supposed to
This is
go,
a promise too, yeah.
don't you dot then next again? No?
Yeah,
So that's a promise that you're about to make?
this is a promise.
Okay, cool. So that's what you did.
The return of this is a promise.
And the return of what you're about to do is a promise? Oh,
Yes. So if we console log this thing. I've never tried this. Let's see what happens. Don't try this at home. It's a promise.
Yeah.
It tells you the promise is pending. Interesting. But it got resolved really fast. Okay. But if you wrap your console log around the whole thing, like this is a promise too. See? Oh, all got resolved. And we got our array back of stuff. So just believe me when I tell you these things that we're working with are promises. Okay.
What do you do with that second promise?
So now, okay, so we got some random internet garbage response from this that was like status 200, whatever. We want to turn that internet stuff, we want to take the response out of it and res.json it. And now it's going to give us actual stuff that we can deal with. And to prove that, let's console log what happens. So we get some response. Say we don't know what this is going to be, let's find out. What do you think it's going to be?
It's going to be JSON data. It's going to be objects.
Exactly. It's going to be all our animals. There we go. But,
So that's a promise though, but you put it then.
yes.
No? Okay.
And this is what we want to do after we get a response. But let's not pretend like we don't know what's going to be here. What are we really getting here? What's that JSON data? Animals.
Oh.
So we can just put animals. Okay. Now let's go back to an interesting concept that we talked about when we did callbacks. Remember, like with map?
How come you never patch?
Never what?
I'm joking. I said, how come you use patch?
Forget patch. Not doing that stuff. Okay, so remember this thing? Remember when we defined this like this? And we did an array.map, and you can technically just pass it a callback. So you can do like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dot map, and you can just give it a callback. And you don't have to pass anything into the callback as arguments because it already knows to pass in each one of these values. Well, this is just the callback that we've defined. And we don't have to specify in the parentheses to pass each value, right? In fact, that would actually be really bad because then it wouldn't be a callback anymore. We would be like immediately invoking this. So where I'm trying to get with this is with promises, it's kind of the same thing. So instead of passing this thing that comes out as a callback and then passing it here, we can actually just put console log. Has anyone seen this syntax? This will be like the callback, and it knows that whatever's passed out from here, it's going to get passed into this uninvoked callback, right? So you can do stuff like this. It just deletes some redundancy. If you're not comfortable with this syntax, then just do it the other way. But it'll still work. So I'll comment that out. And I'll make a note, same as that's why you gotta know the JavaScript fundamentals to do this kind of stuff. Alright. But what do we want to do when we get our animals? What do we want to do with them?
For each.
Yeah, we want to put each animal on the DOM, right?
Yeah.
So we want to do all this stuff, right? So maybe it makes sense to put this in a function. Otherwise, it's going to get really, really cluttered. So how do we want to do this? Put animal on DOM, something like that. And it's going to take that animal object and it's just going to do all of this, right? Ah, yeah. Okay. So now, what do we want to do with our animals? We want to for each them. We still want to for each animal. And then for each animal, we just want to put it on the DOM. Yes. I hope this works. I probably broke something. And it still works. Nice. Jonathan?
If you go back to the header, what happens if you leave an object as one?
I don't think you can.
You have to set parameters.
The other relationship was that one used to, what was that called again? That one was talking about.
Destructuring? Maybe. Maybe we can do destructuring. I'm very confused why it was breaking before.
Remember when we changed the
I don't know, man. Let's see what happens. Now it works. This is destructuring, basically. So now, I don't know.
It works now.
I think it works with functions. So this is JavaScript saying, okay, you're doing this weird thing where you should be passing me a named argument, but I'm seeing curlies. I trust that that means you have one named argument that's actually an object and that it has these keys inside it. So then instead of doing like object.name, object.species, I can just use that.
So, like, how come Roman knew about it? Like, did Ram give a lecture about this?
Yes, there's going to be some ES6 lectures, I think week 3, with stuff like this. Okay, so we've put our animals on the DOM. We have our click event. Anything else we want to do? Do you want to do a post, or is it too late?
Post.
Okay. Ka. Do delete? Like delete an animal?
Like delete the div if there's a div already. Like when you click on it, it shows up. Can you like get rid of it?
Of this?
Oh, yeah.
Like now this scrolls up and you click on it.
So if I click on it again, make this disappear? So do like a toggle? We could.
Well, like, he's asking, like, for the div, like, if you press anywhere on the div, it'll disappear.
Anywhere on the div?
Yeah.
Which div? Press on the name?
So you know how if you refresh refresh the page, it would just be blank. Right? That's the output he wants. Like if you clicked on the name, and then you click that name again, it would go away.
We could.
Is that what you're saying? Okay.
We could.
Yeah.
How would we do that?
How would we do that?
Yeah, so how would we set up that toggle?
I think there's two ways. There's one where you can actually have use toggle, and then there's another way you just use if else. I think. I don't remember.
We could do it with if else. Would you rather do this or do a post? So I feel like post is relevant.
Hint, hint, nudge, nudge.
Let's do post. Let's do post. Let's do a form, and then if you guys are still up to it, you can stay and we can do it as well. Yeah, it's a much simpler concept than post, and I want to make sure you get how to do post. So let's make sure we have a little form where we can add a new thing. So maybe here we can have a little form. What do we want to name our form? Create animal. What goes in a form? Like this? Let's look it up. HTML form. What? So you can just use something like this, right? If you don't remember how to do it, Google it. I don't remember how to do things like forms. I just Google them every time. Forms are not that fun. Okay. Yeah, it is. It's a decent amount. So what are our parameters in our form? Name, species. And the best one? Image. And then, does anyone know what this thing is for? Because this is super useful. Simon.
The URL.
Is it to link it to a link?
Yes. Basically. It helps us know what we're selecting. So if we would actually want to name this the same as whatever the property is. So like name, species, legs. So we have a form. So let's grab the form and put an event listener to it so that when you're typing and submitting things into the form, we can actually make a new object out of it. So how do I grab the form? That's not pretty. That's fine. How do I grab this form?
That's the idea.
Mm-hmm.
What's the
We
idea?
could.
What's the idea?
Create animal, I think. No, it's not the idea.
It's, wouldn't it be the idea? Wouldn't it be the idea of the div? Or
Give it
I have to give it one.
Let's give it one. Yeah, that's right.
you're talking about it's right there.
There we go. That's our form. What's the event listener that we want on our form in order to create a new thing? in the database. It is a submit event, right? So now we know how to grab this form. So let's save it as a variable. Now what? Event listener on form. What does the event listener take as its arguments? And what do we want to happen? So let's think about it.
Want to prevent
We do. Those are like the minutia. We do want to prevent the default. But there's two major things we want to happen when we hit submit on that form. Think back end and front end.
Method. Post.
There's two things we want to happen. We want to save to our database, and we want to have a new thing appear on the DOM. Show the new thing on DOM. Something like that, right? Okay. Which one do you want to focus on first? Do you want to do optimistic rendering or pessimistic rendering? Or do those words not make sense?
I don't think we ever went.
Okay,
I know
so
what it is though. You spent 30 seconds ago.
okay, the idea of optimistic rendering is
Instagram 30 seconds. Instagram when you like a post and you're like underground, right? And then like on the train, and then you like it, and it's like
Really?
right? But like when you go back to it, it's not like
they use optimistic rendering. What bad habit? Okay, good to
it's
know.
not liked. When you go back to it, like when you're
Okay.
off from it.
So the idea of okay.
So it's like when you try to change something and that doesn't save to the database.
Exactly. That is it. That is exactly it. So the idea of optimistic versus pessimistic rendering. We need to do two things. We need to save the thing to the database, and we need to add the new thing to the DOM. We really don't want to be displaying things in the browser that aren't coming from our database. So pessimistic rendering is let's make sure it's in the database first before we display it. Optimistic rendering is like, okay, I tried to add this to the database. I trust that it worked, so I'm going to put it on the DOM, and then I'm going to add it to my database. So it's kind of like the order in which you approach these things.
So right now this is pessimistic because we're saving first.
Yeah, but we haven't done it yet, so we don't have anything right now. So if we want to save something to the database, what do we need to do? We want to interact with our API. What do we need to do? We do. How do we do that here? We do the fetch. We do the fetch. Okay, this is the part where I need to Google fetch API post, because a lot of stuff comes up. And there's a very clear example in the documentation of how to post stuff. So you have your fetch, you have the URL, and now it takes a second parameter, which is an object. And there you tell it the method post, that you want to post something. And you need to tell it headers. And you need to give it a body. We don't need to do this other stuff. So what's the URL that we're trying to post to? This one. Yes, this is the RESTful route, right? So if I leave it like this, it's just going to think this is a GET request. So I need to give it another object that has other options in it. And it needs to include three things. It needs to include method, which is what? Post. It needs to include what else? Headers, which is
Application JSON.
yeah, this stuff you just get from the documentation.
Oh, you saw it? Or you I just remember.
Good. And it needs to get something else, which is body. Body. This is the most important part. This is the object that you're trying to post. But we can't just put the object here. We have to do JSON.stringify. And then here is where we can put the object. Okay, and what does a new animal need to look like? What does it need to have? Name. Species. Exactly. Legs, hobby, image. This is what we need to send to our database. The thing is, we gotta get this information off the form. Right? So if I'm trying to make a new animal, who should it be? Me, Jane? I'm gonna be a cat. Oh, this is a very unfortunate form, guys. It's not lined up well at all. I'm not gonna put the image for now. But I need to grab this stuff out of the form. How do I grab these different things out of the form? We do? How do we get to the input form? How do we get to the input field? Too complicated. There's an easier way. How do we get all of these different values? No. No delegation. Okay, so listen. Everyone's getting tired. If we have the form and we added an event listener to submit, you can access the event. Yes. Because the event is happening on the whole form. It's not happening on those individual fields. So what does event look like? I don't have a submit button. Did you guys see that? Did you see how when I click submit, it flashes really quickly and goes away? Why does that happen? Exactly. So that's where you prevent default. Remember with Rails, when you had forms and you hit submit, it refreshed and it redirected and all that stuff? That's the normal behavior of a submit button on a form. So in order to prevent that from happening, because it doesn't look like a very sexy application when you keep having it refresh, we can prevent the default to prevent it from refreshing. And that way it looks a lot better. And that's like how modern applications are made. So we can do event.prevent default. So now, oh look, some stuff happened. Oh, our post request is working. All right, so I submit this. I'm getting the event, right? Where do we want to go from there? Event target. What does event.target represent? Event.target, guys, this is very, very important. Please listen. Event.target represents the element to which the event happened. So since I had this event attached, or I had this like event thing attached to the actual form, the form is the event target. So it's wherever the event listener was attached. So now I have this whole form and I have the power to access the things in all of the separate fields. Any ideas of how to access the things in the fields? So now that I have my form selected from doing event.target, any ideas of how I can access the different things typed in the fields?
The name.
Exactly, the name attribute. So it's dot name, and then
Dot value.
dot value. Shall we test it out? I have too many console logs. I want to get rid of some of them. I don't know where any of them are.
So it's good you have console log, event target, all that stuff there.
I want to get the individual things from the form. Guys, it's getting late. Everyone's really tired. I did this the other day.
Really? Thank you, Jane. Oh, yeah, yesterday you did. Thank you. Thank you, Jane.
I think you have to put what it's actually called. Does this work? Hello? Hello? There we go. All right. So this part you can change. This is like the name attribute of the form. So you can put whatever you called it in your HTML. So see how we had a field for name, we had one for species, for legs, for hobby, for image. In order to grab whatever the user typed, you just do event.target, whatever you named it, and then .value. So that way you can grab all of them, right? So I can do something like let name equal this thing. Yeah, and you can set it for all of them. So we can do it for species. Hmm? There's a lot of people still here. I hear a lot of noise. Okay, so this is how we grab all of them, right? So now we can put them all in here so that we can send them off to make this object, right? So I can give it name, I can give it species. This is the other half of destructuring in JavaScript. Anytime you have something like this, where you have a key called name, but you also declared a variable called name, a small shortcut to save you some time is just doing this.
Why does that work?
That's another part of like JavaScript ES6 destructuring. So not only can you do stuff like this, destructure an object this way, this is like the backwards way of doing it. So instead of doing name colon name, anytime you have a variable that matches this, and it's the same thing as the key, for a shortcut you can just put the key. And it's going to be the same thing.
That only works if it's the same.
Exactly, exactly. So you can do
You
this.
set your variable to the same as the key. Then
Exactly. That's it. So now we send this to the database. And how do we check if it works? So what do we get as a response from this promise? Once it fulfills, what are we going to get? We're going to get some internet garbage first that tells us that it was successful or not. So we're gonna get some response. So we have to res.json it, just like last time. And then, what do we get after we res.json it?
Oh, you mean from the design?
Yes.
We get another promise.
We do get another promise. But once this fulfills, what should this look like? What should the result of that be?
Again, what we put in the form, right?
It's gonna be, exactly, it's gonna be the new object. So it's gonna be the animal. Exactly. Alright, after this we can stop. Sorry I kept you guys so long. So, now, if I do like, Jane is a cat with 4 legs, who likes sleeping, and who looks like, maybe not like Kingsley Shacklebolt. I like this cat. That's how you guys look right now. So if we put it in here, look, we got our cat object back. So once we got this back, the next logical step would be here we would append that thing to the DOM or whatever. Because now we know it exists in our database. And in fact, since this was successful, if I were to refresh the page, since it loads everything that's in my database, it is going to load Jane the cat and show me the stuff. But we are missing the step of like not having to refresh and put it on the DOM. I know you guys are really tired, and we kind of did that already for the other piece, so you guys know how to do it.
Huh. Sweet.
It was a lot. Oh, sweet. We did the whole roadmap. Yes.
So one thing about lecture videos,
Mhm.
which I don't know if there's a feature for it, but like how can we download them? Because sometimes you're on the train and stuff, and just like run over.
Yeah, YouTube Premium, dog.
Oh. I don't know. Can you buffer it?
It's a 3-month free
What
trial.
if you
dog.
buffer it? Like load it up on your phone or whatever?
It
It's
won't
a
buffer
3-month
that
free
much.
trial, dog.
I tried. It
We
won't
done with the
buffer.
program.
It isn't like I don't ever have enough time to buffer the whole video by the time I get over there.
Is
there any way
in the treehouse? I have
I don't know, live somewhere we can like download and access
I mean, we can ask Graham to just put them on Slack. and
yeah,
we can
like,
download.
just have them like that.
There's a
We
free
could do
trial
that
on
too.
YouTube for 3 months, dog. We done with the program for the time. Yeah.
I'm gonna turn off the recording now. Is that okay?
That's
That's good.